down south and London especially, everything's very expensive. And I don't understand how there can be a difference in price of things when we're in the same country. We're all supposed to be as one. There's not supposed to be a north-south divide anymore. That's what we want to get rid of, that divide. We want to be equal. Even in Scotland, we want to be all as one on the same level playing field. Not them down south get richer and you get poorer. It must have been an equal playing field.
You're so right, and that's again what COVID-19, but even before, the regional inequalities and regional disparities were there. We don't want, this has to be the moment, whether you call it levelling up or whatever it is, to say, that very much that point, James, at the end of the day, we are all equal, or should be, but we're not. Anyway, so can I introduce Mayor Steve Roberum from Liverpool City Region. Really, Steve, really interested to hear what you've got to say from your point of view in terms of your experience, but also your thoughts on what you've heard and, that whole thing about building back and what the North needs. So over to you.
Thanks, Jill. I don't know whether Jamie's on the same call I'm on, but I've got to go in 3 or 4 minutes and Jamie hasn't had a chance to speak. So if we can do a double act between ourselves, I think first of all, can I just say to James, listen, it's great to hear from people like yourself who've experienced those terrible moments during this pandemic. And hopefully what Jurgen Klopp has brought you is at least some release from that frustration that obviously I think we all feel on your behalf. And he's promised me that it won't be long before we get not just 19, but 20 and more. So that's something for you to look forward to and hopefully brighten your horizons. Look, Jill, we've touched on Build Back Better. And as you know, I was one of the co-creators of Build Back Better with Andy Burnham. And what we were talking about at that time is not just the criticality of the economic measures that we need to put in place so that we can build back better. But I think what Ben Lucas spoke about before was really important, and that's about the social agenda. It isn't just about tarmac or steel. It's about people and skills also, and they do and can go hand in hand. Trying to get through the list, you've talked about good jobs and employment charters. Louise, there's a fair employment charter that we're developing in Liverpool as well. So if you're talking about Greater Manchester, it'd be helpful if you talk about Liverpool City Region, because we lead on many of these social agenda issues. And if you speak to Neil, Neil will tell you about which city region is leading on community wealth building. And it's not our friends in Greater Manchester, it's where the Premier League resides. On inclusive growth, I think it's really important, inclusive growth, and it has to be genuine. How you can implement and embed inclusive growth is by ensuring that the procurement processes by which you go out and spend the money that comes from devolved pots in our areas, how you can use that differently. And you can use it differently, and you can attract socially trading organisations and voluntary community sector and the whole gambit of different organisations who for far too long and certainly too often they are completely missed out on being able to access some of these funds. And I just want to touch on skills if I can, because it's my big one. Skills and employment, really important. Look, it'd be churlish, wouldn't it, if we didn't recognise that at least Rishi Sunak, Chancellor of the Exchequer, did mention skills and did put some money towards some of the things that we'd like to see happening. Again, it's been discussed about retrofitting. The real problem for me is the lack of understanding of how you deliver those big sums of money so that we actually get those people into the good jobs and give them the training. And the way you do it is sequencing it. And it doesn't matter whether it's 3 billion, 300 billion, if it's not being spent and it's not given delivery, then you can announce any figure you want. I'll guarantee that if somebody does some analysis in 6 months' time, out of that £3 billion, 10 bob's being spent. Hardly anything at all, because the infrastructure is not right to deliver some of those things. You can't turn the tap on for skills. There's a whole host of things that have to happen behind that. So if you want to look at green skills, for instance, you have to look at skills capital investment to get workshops converted. You have to attract people with the right occupationally relevant qualifications to be able to train the people in this skills qualification area. That can't happen overnight. And that's why it needs to work through mechanisms like combined authorities, because Jamie and myself, we can do that, and we can align supply in our areas, so what comes through colleges and training providers, with the demand that we've already forecast, because guess what? We've got skills assessments in our own areas. And with that canter through, I'll hopefully give Jamie the last say on this, but I've got to go, Jill, but thanks for the invite.
No, it's been great to see you, and I thought probably Liverpool's success might have crept into this very important conversation. So well done, Liverpool. I'm a Man U friend, actually, but let's not go there. Terrible game the other night. Anyway, more importantly, thanks very much, Steve. And now let's bring Jamie into the really important debate around where do we go from here, Jamie. And I'm really interested to see from your perspective around the work you're doing in the North Tyne.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, I think it's worth thinking about the environment we're in and first getting the context. Neil was saying this is not a linear crisis. I don't want to be having this conversation again in 10 years' time saying how do we get out of the next hole we're in. So my view hasn't changed about what needs doing. It hasn't changed from what I was saying in January, the work I was doing, what I said in my acceptance speech when I was elected last year. We have an economy now that needs to be repurposed for resilience. So exactly the same as I was telling the digital sector last year when we were facing Brexit and an unknown Brexit, possible cliffhanger. We run our global supply chains on a just-in-time basis. It looks great on the balance sheets, it does. But we've just seen that Sweden, who hasn't had a lockdown, well, their factories have closed the same as ours because they can't get the parts. This virus isn't going away anytime soon. If we want to get people back into shops, back into pubs, we need to nail the test and trace system, because that's the only way that's going to give people confidence. The only way that a lot of our industrial and business practices are actually going to get back to the way they were. It's the only way you're ever going to get 396 people on a metro train, is if it's safe to get people in. To do that, we've got to nail the disease. And they did that just fine in New Zealand. And we could have done it and we should have done it. And not too late, sooner or later, we're going to have to face up to that. So resilience, if we look at the damage that austerity has done to leaving us in this situation, it is because there is no resilience in a lot of the public service. There is, it's lovely that on a balance sheet and a business plan, it looks that you've spent everything and every penny's getting value, right until something unexpected happens and then your entire system is unable to cope. The BCSE sector that I've been working closely with in the North of Tyne, over half of those businesses now have no financial reserves to speak of, less than a month of financial reserves. So what happens if something goes wrong? What happens if a CEO of one of those organizations is ill? Who pulls it together? Our food system, we all saw this. We could barely wipe our backsides because we didn't have any resilience in the supply chains. And we're facing a food system. So a lot of our worst affected communities is because these people have no resilience. They don't have savings. Around half the people in this country have less than a month's savings. And I was talking to a taxi driver recently. He was saying, how did you do? He says, well, I've been off for 14 weeks. He says, we're on furlough. He says, no, I'm self-employed. So did you get support for that? He says, no, I only started in December, so I can't. What happens if there's another spike then? He says, I don't know, I have to sign on. So you sign on when you're off. He says, I can't, I had too many savings, but next time I won't. So people's resilience has been eroded by this, and that's what we need to get back to, way beyond where it was. I've seen that in business as well. But if we're talking about crisis, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is saying that we have to limit it to 1.5 degrees of temperature rise. To do that, it's slightly technical, don't worry about the numbers. We have to keep global carbon dioxide to 430 parts per million in the atmosphere. It's already 416. It's gone up 3.4 parts per million since July the 11th last year to July the 11th this year. But on that basis, we're going to hit that 1.5 degrees target in 2024. And there's feedback effects. We saw the Amazon burning last year in Australia and parts of the Arctic, and we're going to see these things again. The planet is now match funding our carbon emissions. So, I mean, my kids are 12 and 14, and they are going to be the last generation that will grow up in a climate stable planet. And so when we're talking about resilience, this is not just for the corona crisis. This is the future, and we've got to nail resilience in a big way. So the Good Work Pledge. Procurement has got to be a big part of it. The North of Tyne Good Work Pledge, we have ending exploitative contracts, we have paying the real living wage, so that it's enough that people can get by on without getting into debt. We have not only support for trade unions, there's a requirement to have a trade union recognition agreement in place. So that is, so Peter Steve's not here still because I got to wind him up because I was better than this. We have in-work progression, which is absolutely key, because it's important that people not only they have a future, actually it's skilling up the workforce, that's how it happens, and the companies are operating on a social basis. Now, I would love it if we could have social licensing. As Neil says, that's beyond the powers that we have at the moment. So, and I've just been on a call, the call that Steve's gone off to, it's this time, with the Employment Minister, Mim Davis, and she gets this, she's talking about using social value clauses in it, and we need to be using them as robustly and boldly as we can, and not just having it as an also ran, and, you know, if you're giving some strips to the kids who are playing football, is that no, have you embedded the North of Tyne Good Work Pledge in this or not? Because if you haven't, forget it. We're not going to work with you. And that's something that we need to be rolling out across the whole of the public sector and the private sector. And there's a lot of private sector employers, actually, they want a level playing field and don't want the exploitative employers having a fair chance on that basis. We can't have a recovery that's based on concrete and tarmac. Yes, we do want those infrastructure things, but in the budget on March the 11th, Rishi, and he's absolutely stepped up and put money into the furlough scheme. But I remember him saying, we very proudly, we're going to put £1 billion into green transport. And then the next sentence he says, and we're putting 27 billion into tarmac. And I was thinking that kind of is conflicting with your own signals there, mate. You know, so what we want is, when we're talking about this, is that we're absolutely right. I agree with everything he says in terms of wraparound support for employment and all these programs that we're working there. But in the interest of time, I'll not tell you how brilliant we are and all the good work we do. What we need is, there's no use giving people a fishing rod if there's no fish in the pool. We actually need a proper industrial, manufacturing, high-skilled jobs base for people to be progressing into. There's no point in having job progression if there's no jobs at the end of it. And that has to come from shortening supply chains. That's one of the best ways we can build resilience. There's no point in having higher environmental standards, higher work standards, higher employment standards and pay here, if they will mean absolutely sod all if we employ everything from people who are employing people at slave wages or planet-wrecking conditions elsewhere. So we need to be using these shortened supply chains to make our industries more robust and to level up the people as well as the regions. Now, if we look at the announcement last week, you know, and I wouldn't swap with Rishi, it's a very difficult job. He had almost no time to get into the position before the crisis hit. But what I would have done, I would have said to me and Stevie and Andy and everybody else, right, there you go, lads, we're all lads at the minute, unfortunately, and said, there's £500 million each, go and build me 5,000 houses and get cracking. And by the way, we'll, you know, find a way to shortcut some of the planning processes. Because that would have created jobs and it would have tackled the housing crisis and build them to eco standards and build them to affordable standards. And then you've got an asset that's worth everything you've paid for it. And you could let it out to local authorities, you could sell them in the market, whatever you do. But these are things that don't wreck the public finances and give you assets and create the jobs and solve the social problems. The offshore industry is going to be a key future for the North of Tyne. The Dogger Bank, the space for 20 gigawatts of electricity, wind turbines on that. At the moment, There's yards along the Tyne struggling because of the transition from the gas and oil industry. We put 24 million to it from the north of Tyne. But if the government said, look, we're leaving the EU, you know, whether you're for it, against it, or indifferent, doesn't really matter, we're leaving, we've left, the transition will have left in January. Here's a signal. We're going to guarantee that 50% of everything that's built in UK territorial waters has to be manufactured in the UK. Money would flood into the yards along the Tyne. I'm ready to start training people up. We can have all the infrastructure, and these are jobs, real jobs, have creating valuable assets. They're going to be generating power. These aren't keep people busy and out of trouble jobs. These are really highly productive jobs. We could have done something on tuition fees. You know, the north of Tyne, we've got about 53,000 students in our local economy. A lot of them come from the Far East. They're not going to come this year because they're worried that we've made a mess of coronavirus. It's not a safe place. If they said, well, we're going to pay your tuition fees, home students, this year and next year, anyone starts, we'll pay your tuition fees. The universities, they wouldn't need bailing out because they could have the money from doing what they're there to do. Teaching people, training people, will massively upskill our workforce on that basis. And we could tailor it into all sorts of things, whether it's the right industrial or vocational things. The universities have the capacity to do that. And that's another way that we actually get out of this mess, by increasing the robustness, by doing things that actually have a value. And that's what's needed. We need economic sustainability, we need environmental sustainability, and we need the social sustainability. It's good to hear Simon Clark talking about Devo, and he's been working with us and he's playing ball on that. You know, Stevie Scott's talked about the skills agenda. We have an education challenge to improve the quality of education so there are fewer people falling through the gaps, and we need the Department for Education to sign that off. So I've been working on the group, just needs to sign it off. We want the full transport devolution, because if people can get around, it's better. That's the best way to tackle things like obesity, to tackle air quality issues, to tackle environmental. It makes it more affordable. We want proper devolution, though, going beyond what we've got. You know, we want the investor save principle, that if metro mayors putting interventions in which lower public costs downstream, because we've tackled health inequality, we've tackled all the things that were in the Marmot review, you know, we're tackling the environmental damage, that we don't then see that other public sector budgets are cut because there's less demand on them. We want to keep that money in order to invest into more downstream savings. Neil was talking about a public holding company. I would love to see a regional wealth fund where we're allowed to borrow at base rate to invest in the economy, to see our economy expand in productive ways that match our values and our policies on good work and environmental sustainability. I'd love to see is that things like land value uplift, because a lot of these transport schemes that we've been struggling for decades to get off the ground because we keep having to go through business case to business case as governments change. We have land value uplift. We could have just done them, and we'd have these assets here now and the resilience that came with them. And, you know, do we need a new deal for the North? Yes. It has to be a green New Deal. And do we need jobs? Yes, but not just good jobs. We need worthwhile jobs. And this goes back to the key workers and what James was talking about earlier. And you'll all have heard this meme that, you know, you can be there and you can say to someone, what you're doing is I'm carving a piece of stone. And you can say to somebody else, what you're doing, you can say, I'm building a cathedral. And that's what we want. We want work to have value and meaning and sustainability, so that the people who are key workers can say, well, I'm feeding the country. And the people who are carers and say, I'm looking after people in their old age. And the workers who are welding along the Tyne and say, I'm building our sustainable future for electricity. And that is the sort of economy that we've got to get back to. That's what we needed before this crisis hits, and it's what we need now.
That's great, Jamie. And Neil's clapping there in a virtual clap anyway. Very well said to all our panelists. What I'm going to do, I'm going to invite people out there in our audience. I don't know if Sarah Campbell wants to come in at some point. She's also from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. Mark has been quite vocal on the chat. I'll bring you in if you're ready to come in. But while I'm doing that, I might just go quickly back to Ben and Neil in terms of some of, you know, we've kicked around Manifesto for the North, New Deal, good work charters, the need for collaboration. It's unsurprisingly to me, it's a case of we sort of know what we need to do, and we know what the problem is, and we need to sort of get on with it, which is what I always say. Devolution is a situation where we really need to have those bold ambitions. But in terms of pulling that together, maybe as an output from today, it'd be quite interesting to sort of frame some of that, what the good ideas, because in a way I think we're all singing from a similar hymn book, but it needs to be drawn together. So I'll go back to Ben first, just to get your illuminating thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I would say the obvious thing, which is that there's an issue about timing. So it needs to be done soon, because I mean, several people have commented on Rishi Sunak's financial statement last week, and I think people have said that he's been in a difficult position. He's in some ways reacted effectively to some of the most immediate challenges, particularly through the job retention program. But I would say that really last week was a placeholder at best. And what I think he's doing is waiting to see what happens next. And I think what's important is that the North collectively tries to fill that void and sets out a proposition for what we want to see happening and how that needs to happen. And I think, what the Metro mayors and other council leaders have experienced, from what I can see, is a sort of strange kind of artificial world in which government has carried on often as if it does exercise power. And so it's had these 5 o'clock press conferences. But very often what it's said isn't really connected to any levers. And so Jamie's point about test and trace and lots of other points about the system is absolutely right. In reality, a country is a complex system of interwoven moving parts, and you need a systems way of thinking and managing that. And that requires a partnership between mayors, regions and national government, and for each to recognise their own role in that process, and then for an overarching vision about what you're trying to do. And I think people have different terms. The government call it levelling up. We might call it community wealth building, building back better. But there are hopefully elements of everyone recognising that the previous model was broken even before we went into coronavirus. And there's a spectrum from some of the kind of more radical ideas that I'm sure most of us on this panel would like to see happen, through to people who may not be quite so radical, but at least recognise that something needs to change. And I think what we need to do is pull together very rapidly an agenda that sets out how we're going to make that happen. And critically, one of the things that Neil's phrase about architecture is really important here. We've seen a huge reduction in the capacity and resilience of the system to be able to just do an ordinary job, let alone respond to a crisis on this scale. And so if we were to repurpose the economy in the way that we've been talking about, then we also need to think through what's the sort of, what kind of capacity and systems do we need to underpin that? And what's the role of operating at a regional level as well as at a local level in making that happen? So we need some headline propositions, and then we need some kind of more serious system thinking about how to actually make it happen, I think.
Yeah, I unsurprisingly, I agree with you, but let's, on that theme of making it happen, Neil, I'll bring you in.
I agree with that, and just to take that on, just for time purposes, I agree with what Ben's saying, and I think echoing Jamie there, and also Steve and others, is that this crisis is a mobilisation moment of old ideas, or old ideas of how you create a good economy, an economy that works well for well-being, and it should be a mobilisation moment, and that is the challenge here. It's not the positive ideas of what do we do. We know kind of what we need to do. And the problem we have in capacity terms in the North is I think we've been policy fed, not policy led. And it's time for us to step up. I don't think, to be perfectly honest, that previous devolution has tried to fit in to Whitehall's agenda. Northern Powers has tried to come from Osborne, and we're trying to fit into it. I don't think we're going to get much great. We've got some stuff, and I'm sure Jamie and Steve are working hammer and tongs to get things from Whitehall, but we need another agenda that actually says, you know what, Whitehall, we need this, and it's a step change to mobilise the sort of things that Jamie's talking about. The pleading, I think the North has been pleading, hand out, can I get a bit more, please? That needs to stop. We ask and demand, and they tell us why we don't get it. Because what Jamie was talking about, what he was talking about, is common sense economics. There is no alternative. That is the alternative. That's what Scotland's doing. That's what Wales is doing. That's what Catalonia is doing, or trying to. That's the common sense response to a universal pandemic and a crisis. And finally, on the capacity point, I feel sorry for the devolved administrations, really, because they've got some people, they're underpowered. I know from being working now in the Scottish Government, I'm not saying they're doing perfect, they've got teams of people working to mobilise different ways of doing things. I'm not, working up real propositions, real things with, substance. What Jamie's talking about, I'm not saying they're not worked up. That needs a team of people to work those things up. And from a think tank point of view, who's paying for that? Whitehall isn't. And there's not enough money in devolved administrations to do it. So we need to mobilise all of us and outside who's listening into this. How do we get some money together so we can get people around the table and start to work this up? Because it's all grunt work and it all takes time. And then we can have these oven-ready propositions and asks and demands that go right to Whitehall.
Yeah. So, okay, I've got Sarah Campbell, Mark and Tom in that order. If you just want to quickly come in, Sarah.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Can you hear me, everyone?
Yeah, that's great.
It's been a really fab panel. Thanks so much for all your input. I was really, really enthused to hear Jamie talking about kind of quality of jobs, because I think that's part of the conversation we're wanting to have here today is around, well, what does good jobs actually look like? And Neil's input there on looking at well-being. And that's something that we're really, really kind of concerned about and worried about, that we shouldn't be creating jobs at kind of any cost. And that's been a really big theme of the work that we've been doing with workers who are on the sharp end of a failing economy, basically, and especially for workers like James, who are at the end of a chain of agency work. And looking at the conditions that are inherent in those types of works. And I'd be really interested to hear again from James on, because he outlined what some of the poor working conditions are, but from his perspective, what does good work look like? And to hear a bit more from James on that.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm just going to quickly, because I'm conscious of the time, I will come back to you, James, so just hold that thought. But I'm going to bring in Mark and Tom, and then we'll do a quick roundup from everybody. So Mark, if you can unmute.
Hello, I'm not sure if there's more than one Mark here.
Yeah, yeah, that's it, Mark, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for all the contributions. I mean, it's a hugely challenging time. It's really interesting to see the commonality across different areas of the North. We're grappling with the similar challenges. But yeah, this representation issue, I think, was really interesting that Neil raised about how you take your message to central government. Matt Ainsworth in Manchester was very effective in doing that some years ago to really change how the relationship with DWP worked there. And there were a lot of key levers that were managed to get pulled at that time that have really helped to bring services together in a devolved and meaningful way. So I think there's a lot of scope to use the opportunity of not in a cynical way, in a genuinely reform oriented way to use this opportunity to press again for better integration of services, for better devolution, and especially better devolution of skilled services.
Thanks, Mark, for that. And Tom, if you can unmute. No. Well, I'll bring you back in. Well, if we're unmuting Tom, I'll bring Jane. So let's go back to the question posed by Sarah there, really about, from your perspective, what does good work look like?
When I worked for the Marks and Spencer's job in the warehouse, there were a lot of bad management. They wouldn't really talk to you and listen to you when you had problems. So it was quite hard, because you were like the third tier down on the list, because you were the agency, under the agency. Your voice didn't really get heard as much, so you were really in a bit of a losing battle, really. When you wanted time off and anything like that, or you had a problem when my father-in-law passed away last year, I couldn't get time off for the funeral, so I had to take days off, which was unpaid. So it was really hard, you know, and not really, you know, felt as if you weren't really appreciated. But yet, when I went to work for the food bank, you know that when you're there, you're helping people out when they're feeling at their lowest, and you're feeling like you're appreciated, and they always appreciate what you do, because even though you didn't get paid, you were voluntary. You know, it seems to be the voluntary jobs you seem to appreciate more, because and it was really, you know, you felt like you're doing something for the community, not just for yourselves, but you were helping the community out in your town, your city where you work.
Yeah.
And it's like that sort of thing, you know, you feel like you're appreciated that way.
Yeah, it is just value, isn't it? About being appreciated and valued for your contribution. So many people forget that. Beth, I know you've got to jump off, but I'm just going to quickly go round there for a really sort of wind up statement, comment really on, you know, that new deal for the North, where we go from here. So I'll start with you, Beth, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think it is about collaboration and a collective voice, isn't it, really? And I think Ben mentioned, or maybe Neil, about us articulating as a collective the deal we want for the Northern workers. We know what the problems are, we know where the inequalities are, we've got the solutions, but actually this is what we want to make it happen. And let's have consistency around the governance structures, because let's face it, the reality is it's all based on relationships and who knows who. So, you know, in terms of LEPs, combined authorities, you know, it's not part of the constitution to have voluntary community organisations on there, or trade unions, right? Those relationships and paths have been carved from years and years worth of work and building reputational relationships and partnerships. So it needs to be, you know, a level playing field for all organisations, not just the business organisations, because we've got a real voice to play. I've got a lot more to say, but I think for me, collaboration, partnership, working collectively.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's been fantastic. I think we could all carry on talking all day, but time's against us. I think the main thing is we do want to get something out of today, which pushes this forward. And I think certainly with Neil and Ben and others that have been here today, and the Metro Mayors and the people we have on the call, I think we can really actually say this is what came out of today, and, you know, come up with a plan to do things differently. But I think, picking on your point, you know, it's not pleading, it's about leading. I would say that's my catchphrase for this session. Stop pleading and start leading. So and I think with Jamie, you're obviously a fine leader. Last thoughts from you.
Well, there's a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to glory. Omitted, and all the voyage of his life is bound in shallows and in miseries. It's much more complicated than that. I love Shakespeare. But
very impressed.
We are facing a whole series of crises that are going to be going on. This is not a hump we're getting over. It's not a just get back to where we were. There is no equilibrium in the economy. There never has been. Things change over time, and we must build for resilience in the future. And that involves collaboration and communication. It goes way beyond a party issue. And I thought you rode back brilliantly in the beginning, Jill, when you said that Steve and I were opposite ends of the spectrum.
I meant geography. But very good. All right. And Neil, last thoughts, and I'll go Ben, and then we'll end where we started with Louise. Okay, Neil.
Yeah, I just repeat, I think if there's some way through Devo Connect or Northern Powers, or some way that we could get together. I don't mean a conference, I don't mean a big, singing dance, just a group of people, maybe people that's not even, that's listening in, get together and say, what could we really turn the dial on? And my organisation, myself, is committed to putting time and energy into that. So that there's an offer there, I suppose. It's needed. There's nobody else but us.
Yeah, well, let's do it. And Ben.
Yeah, to me, I think this is a theme that came across quite a lot at the Convention for the North last year as well, which is really about have confidence, exercise power, don't call for it, and therefore collaboratively set out what it is that we will commit to, the various organisations working together, that we can do anyway, and we are determined to do, and what's the basis of the deal with government going forward.
Yeah, brilliant. And last but not least, Louise.
Lots of reflections. First thing I really take from this is the sense of scale, that we need. That kind of scale is going to be quite momentous to as you said, Neil, it's not just about one recovery. This is much more than that. So that's important. The second thing is the people side, that our investors, we need to invest in the people of the North, whether that's thinking about skills, transport, childcare, as well as good work. And I'd like to make a point that we should have a recovery that works for the women of the North too, because we're already seeing a gender pay gap that potentially widening, across the UK in terms of the impact of this crisis. And we also know the high levels of poverty, particularly around for single parents. If we want to actually address poverty in the North, we really need a plan that's going to work for the women of the North too.
And that was a hear from James, I think. So well done. And what a great note to end on. I think it's been an absolutely brilliant discussion. I think we've got something there. I think it has got an output. We were going to do a straw poll on who wants to do a new, do we need a new deal? I think the answer to that question is yes, we do. And we're all behind it. So let's hope this is the beginning of something. And, the moment is now, as they say, and the challenge is just huge. So can I just thank everyone, particularly James, for his excellent contribution, which was very much valued and appreciated, as you should always be when you're working. But particular thanks to our Metro Mayors, Jamie Driscoll from the North of Tyne, Steve Roberum, who's now talking to Gillian Keegan, I think, about skills, and Ben Lucas from Metro Dynamics, Neil McEnroy from Claire's, and of course Louise and from Joseph Rowntree Foundation, thank you very much. And last but not least, Beth, fantastic to have you on the line. So as I say, this is hopefully the beginning and not the end, and I look forward to seeing you at some point, either on the Zoom or in real life, but let's keep talking. All right, thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.
Goodbye, thank you.
Bye.